So I actually wanted to make a video that's a little bit different than this one. I wanted to make a video saying that all of these things that you see on the internet when people are like, "Oh no, everybody's doing this and they're wrong," are those are actually wrong because nobody actually thinks the thing that they're arguing against. But in this case, I think a lot of people on the internet think that metagaming is actually bad. Metagaming in the context of Dungeons and Dragons, and we'll define what that is eventually. But I did like a non-zero amount of research for this, and I found a bunch of people arguing very strongly against metagaming. Um, and I think that's wrong. I think that, I mean, it's kind of funny because I've seen a number of content creators that I respect have said, no, it's not really a problem. And I think it's actually the opposite. I think it's actually a thing that you want to encourage to some extent with some qualifications, and you have to be dealing with it in a certain way in order for you to want to encourage it. But it's definitely not a terrible thing. This is the gist of my point. My thesis is that metagaming is misplaced player investment, and fundamentally, once you agree with that, it's impossible to look at metagaming as bad ever again, I think. I've got a slightly different definition of metagaming than the normal one, but we'll talk about that in a second. And all of this other stuff, characters know things, right? If you're a 7th level ranger, you're not a dumbass, right? You know something about the monsters in the world. And there's other stuff that I'll get to when I get there. But the gist is that I think that most people can agree with most of these points. So the normal definition of metagaming that everybody seems to agree to is that metagaming is what happens when a player makes decisions based on knowledge that that player has, but not the player's character. I would posit a very slightly different definition. I would say that metagaming is when a player wants to do something in-game, but they can't do it via in-game methods, so they turn to out-of-game methods instead. And I think this is because when you read about like terrible metagaming stories, they're frequently people going on their phones and looking at at the module or looking at monster stats or changing dice rolls or things like that. And I think that when it's just about knowledge, you start to cut out some corner cases. Now, obviously, you're free to disagree with my definition and say that I'm wrong and that that's not metagaming. But I think that every argument that I make in the video applies to both definitions of metagaming equally. So I think that reframing it to my definition is very useful because it immediately makes the problem apparent that the game is in the way of what the player wants to do. And rather than adjusting either what the player wants to do with the game so that things work, the DM is like, no, you can't do that. So let's talk about misplaced investment for a second. In order to metagame, the player has to actually care. The player isn't going to go on their phone and look up the stats of the monster if they don't care about the game, right? They're just going to not play the game. They're just, going to be content to let their character die or whatever. This is often a sign that the player is more invested in the guy next to him than not. It's sometimes not the case, but if you got a player invested at that point, that's good, and you want to channel that investment into a way that you approve of, a way that players at the other players at the table approve of, and a lot of things that are like good that you want your players to be doing can easily be argued as metagaming. I list reading source books. If your fighter knows all of the rules for how a druid casts spells, how does the fighter know that, right? Like under a strict interpretation of metagaming, you can say that that's not knowledge that the character has. Reading background setting information. If I was running Dragon Heist and one of my players read a bunch of Drizzt novels or all of the old Forgotten Realms source books, like even if they weren't accurate for the edition and even if it wasn't actually reading Dragon Heist, that's arguably metagaming, but it's also investment. It's like the thing that you want your players to be doing. This is the holy grail here, right? Choosing optional character options. Like if my player goes on a character optimization forum and reads all of the things about people's opinions about subclasses and what the difference between College of Lore and College of Whisperers is or whatever based on talking to other players, and then they choose that on their character in game, that's metagaming because the character doesn't have access to those options. So I want my players to do these things. You probably want your players to do these things unless you're running some screwed up game. And if you are, that's fine, more power to you. But I don't think that the consensus, the normal default thing should be don't do that. I think it should be please. I think you should encourage that a lot. The more your players care about the game, the more the other players care about the game, if that makes sense. This is one of the things that I'm really big on. If the DM isn't super into whatever's going on in the game is not going to be good, right? And if one character isn't into what's going on in the game, that's going to kind of have everybody else step back a little bit, and that's no bueno. So the more players at the table are invested, the better the game is. Usually, kind of, sort of. I mean, there's some amount of wiggle room here, but in general, any investment is good investment, right? And if metagaming is misplaced investment, it's still investment, which means it's still kind of positive. When you tell a player, no, you can't do that, no, that thing that you like took the time to think of, that interesting creative option, when you tell a player that they can't do that, that's not fun for anybody usually. Obviously, I mean, it's a mechanical framework that allows a role-playing game to happen, if that makes sense. So occasionally your fighters can be like, I want to put on my rocket boots and jump to the moon. You should say no to that, but you should try to figure out where your player's coming from. And I'll talk about that in a later video probably. One of the things that people don't really like to talk about with metagaming, or one of the things that makes talking about metagaming difficult at the very least, is that it's basically impossible to avoid, right? So all of these are just like really obvious examples. When your player rolls an insight check, they know what they rolled, they know what they added, and they've got a vague idea of what the DC is. I mean, you can do this behind the screen if you really want to, but they're going to be able to guess what they rolled based on your expressions, based on how you say what you say, and based on what you say exactly. They're going to have a decent idea of that, and that's going to change how they interpret the result. And I think you should just embrace that. I think you should just say, oh, okay, you rolled a 4. You don't really know what's up, and the player can actually be aware that they rolled a 4, just embracing that is a much more productive way of playing the game than being like, oh, you gotta pretend you don't know. And moreover, I would actually make the argument that your player shouldn't be making checks if they can fail and then take steps based on the fact that they know they failed, if that makes sense. But that's a different discussion. Another obvious example is that players and characters understand plot structure. They understand pacing, One of the things that I always criticize the terrible television shows that my mother watches is that you can tell who did it on Law & Order based on who the police are talking to like 40 minutes in, right? If it's an hour long show at the 45-minute mark, they're talking to a pretty significant person. And the same thing, like my sessions tend to run about 4 hours. So I've been doing a pretty decent job planning in terms of time and pacing lately. So if at 3 hours and 30 minutes into the session, the players come to like a really big chamber with like a button, it's going to be some sort of climactic finale encounter, right? And if one of my players is like, oh, this is the end of the dungeon, we should take a short rest, I'm not going to be like, no, that's metagaming, that's terrible. I'm going to be like, yeah, it's the end of the dungeon, take a short rest. Because it's just, I can't avoid that, Even if I wanted to, I can't avoid that. And I think it's super good. It's super cool. Characters would probably understand story structure and be picking up on context clues here too, not just the players. Gaming mechanics, the mechanics within the game, the structure of rules that we use to place limits on the role-playing is vital to the experience. And the characters have some knowledge of this, right? Because otherwise the sorcerer would be like, how come I can cast Fireball twice but not 3 times? Like, that doesn't make any fucking sense. But the characters also probably don't know everything. They probably don't know that there's dice involved. They probably understand, roughly, loosely speaking, what critical hits are, but they don't necessarily understand that they're connected to always hitting when you roll a 20, and as a result, when you're having any sort of in-depth tactical discussion, you very quickly run into, does my character know exactly how flanking works, right? And that's a really obvious example. Your character probably has a pretty good idea of how flanking works, but at the same time, you could definitely think of an edge case where, like, one of you is just a gnome and the other one is just flying above him, but you're kind of not quite on adjacent corners. Is that flanking, right? Is this a thing that your character thinks about, or is this a thing that the player thinks about? I don't know. Metagaming also allows for description in a lot of cases when you're DMing. When you say, oh, it's a beholder, it doesn't matter that your player characters might not have seen a beholder. It doesn't matter that they might not even necessarily equate beholder with eye monster. You say it's a beholder, it's this thing on the front cover of this book right here, and you point to the monster manual, right? Like, the flip side of this, actually, one of the more interesting, like, green texty, I guess, stories from this game that I've seen a bunch. A high-level party was like out, and there was nothing going on, and the DM was like, yeah, you guys are just kind of riding on the road, and you see a gazebo off in the distance. The paladin's like, a gazebo? And the DM's like, yeah. And the paladin's like, well, how tall is it? And the DM's like, I don't know, 20 feet. And the paladin's like, I hail it. And the DM's like, what? And the paladin's like, I go up and I greet the gazebo. Does it seem threatening? Do I need to put my lance in it? And the DM's like, it's a gazebo, right? Because we're playing this game where that borrows heavily from the mythology of multiple cultures, from fairy tales and fantasy stories and horror legends or whatever of multiple cultures, right? And not only have the players encountered some of these, the players haven't encountered some of these, right? I made fun of my group a couple weeks ago for fighting a Medusa and not necessarily understanding the legend of Hercules fighting Medusa, right? Because D&D is actually more accurate to that than they were assuming. But the point here is that when we say goblins or when we say shadows or wraiths or zombies or skeletons, we're drawing from a body of real world 21st century literature. We're not drawing from D&D in every case, right? I apologize for the Overwatch noises. One additional major thing is that the player characters are smart, right? Like I've been alluding to this the entire time, but the player characters have some knowledge of how they interact with the framework of rules in the game, right? The sorcerer knows that he can cast Fireball some number of times a day, and he can cast it more powerfully, but he can't cast it less powerfully, and that it doesn't inhibit his ability to cast a second level spell. And I can't think of a second level sorcerer spell off the top of my head, so make fun of me. But the gist is that they have some knowledge of this, right? And again, I think it's very one of the trickiest parts about metagaming is that it's very tough to figure out where this exact line is, right? But if your party's like, oh, the monsters have cast a bunch of spells, they're probably out of spell slots. Yeah, they're right. They would know that. If they're like, oh, there's some treasure here, maybe we should do this before we fight the boss so that we can become more powerful. Yeah, they would know that. They've got a vague idea of how experience works. They know that loot is good, right? If they're familiar with a faction or something that's happened in a novel set in the world, that's fine. The players live in the world. The characters live in the world. They've probably read the newspaper. They've probably picked up a travel guide or whatever. If the characters know the trolls are weak to fire or whatever, the players are experienced adventurers. All of this is, they're smart. I think the final, no, not the final slide. Second to final slide here. Policing metagaming is almost always more disruptive than the metagaming itself. When I was researching this, one of the videos I watched was a guy called Matt Colville talking about it, and he said that in one of his games, he was accused of metagaming, kind of rightly so, when he deduced that something was a gelatinous cube from super far off in the distance without necessarily seeing it. And he used some really clever deduction that I honestly would have been super neat to add to the game. If instead of being like, oh, that's metagaming, people had been like, huh, your character's really smart. And they'd asked him for advice in the future, and they'd talked about it as if it was like an in-character thing, because it was. That would have added a lot of depth to the game, but instead he got yelled at a little bit because people were like, oh, that's metagaming. You knew that, but your character would not have known that. And this is me terribly paraphrasing, so I hope that I've not completely ruined this example, but the gist here is that in my fantasy recreation, which is probably not accurate, of this game, if you just ignore it, if you just say, oh, that's cool, and move on with it, it's a positive experience for everybody at the table, including him. He figured it out. Everybody else is like, whoa, he's really smart, and they get to interact with that in game. But instead, if you're like, oh, that's metagaming, then you've invalidated an action. You have to like kind of figure out what that means. And in the context of the story, you're going to roll back and pretend that he didn't say it. Does everybody have to pretend that they don't know this now? And it also means that they don't have this cool thing anymore. Yeah, it's also just super disruptive to be paying attention to what other people do and even to be policing yourself at that level. That's not fun. And finally, metagaming is really difficult to pin down. I'm sure that everybody watching this video has disagreed at some point with something that I've been like, oh, this is metagaming, or this isn't metagaming, So you don't want to stop playing the game to have that argument. That's not fun. This is like third to last slide. Wow. Role-playing is fun when it's not a requirement. Everything is more fun when it's not a requirement. Your players, even if you have this talk with your players, even if you share this talk with your players, and even if you're like, yes, please metagame, some of them are going to be like, my intelligence is 7. I'm not smart enough to solve this puzzle. And that's fine as long as it's a choice, right? As long as the player is choosing consciously that they don't want to jump forward to the solution right now, that they're content to sit back and let it play out, knowing that at any point they could say, oh, I figured it out. That's a lot more fun than being like, oh, your character's too stupid to interact here. You can't do this, right? That's not fun I don't think that's fun for anybody. I don't think that's fun as the DM. I don't think that's fun for the player. So by saying yes, you can do it, you give your players the option to avoid metagaming when they think it's fun. And I think that's perfect. I think that's absolutely perfect. I think that's an ideal system. And finally, this is kind of the crux of it, right? In the earlier example with Matt's character, Colville, if he drops the torch or whatever, and he's like, oh, it's a gelatinous cube, and one of the other characters is like, whoa, how did you know that? Do you have experience with gelatinous cubes? He gets the chance to add that to his backstory, right? He gets the chance to role play and make up a reason and create a slightly more than one-dimensional character about how he has this knowledge. I think that this is one of the super coolest things. When players in my campaign do things and I'm like, their character might not know that. I say, does your character know that? And if they say, yeah, I'm like, cool. And they do. And that's it. I never, ever, ever challenge beyond that. I probably shouldn't even be challenging like that. I should be asking, how does your character know that instead? If I want. And the reason I'm asking that isn't because I'm trying to police their actions. The reason I'm asking that is because I'm encouraging them to do a brief exercise and to say, hey, yeah, my character's familiar with the story of Drizzt Do'Urden. He read a bunch of novels about him when he was a kid, because I think that's the thing. I think my 20,000 foot summary of the situation is that the heroes in a number of fantasy universes actually have pulp fiction novels published about them, right? Or, my character's familiar with the city of Waterdeep because I was obsessed with it when I was a kid for reasons, or because I used to work there, or because my uncle lived there and we used to visit every summer, right? These are all like really interesting things that can add nuance to your characters. There's a show called Legends of Tomorrow, which is simultaneously one of the best shows in television, one of the worst shows in television. And there's this character called Rory something, and he's just a really stupid pyromaniac who's a bit of a thug. But you find out in one of the more recent seasons that he's also an author, that he's writing a science fiction book, right? And that adds a crap ton of depth. You can do the same thing to your stupid characters being super smart about things in game. Maybe your character is stupid for, maybe he's got like seven intelligence or whatever, and he's never been to a place, but he's got a lot of knowledge about some aspect because it's something he's interested in, right? That's depth. It's good. It's great. This role-playing exercise is fun. I hope that you don't hate the lack of editing. So yeah, tell me why I'm wrong if I'm wrong, or don't tell me why I'm wrong. I don't really care. Yeah, like it's not gonna offend me if you don't comment or whatever. But I legitimately think that this is like a thing that I actually feel passionate about. I think that it's important to enable your players to invest in the game as much as they can. As much as they're willing to. I think that that's super good, and I think that you want to divert it. I mean, the classic story, right? You're playing D&D with a kid, and he gets super into it, and he starts reading all the books, and then he reads the module, right? You're not going to be like, oh no, that's bad. We're never playing D&D again. You're going to be like, well, I mean, that's part of the fun is that you don't know what's coming up next. You've read the module though, so I'm going to change some things, and we're going to go through it, and you're still going to know some of it, because obviously you care. I think that's a more appropriate solution. Or say, hey, you've read it. Why don't you DM for the rest of your friends for the rest of this, until the module wears out. You're obviously super into it, and this way you get to play all of the monsters instead of just your player. This way you get to role play all of the monsters. But the point is that for some reason when we're dealing with adults, we never take that, or at least it seems like the internet never takes that approach. Instead, they say, oh, you should never play with this guy. He read the module, right? And I think that's, to some extent it's true. The guy's definitely violating some amount of a social contract, especially if, you had any amount of a conversation about that. But at the same time, the guy's clearly invested, right? So why not try to just slightly channel that into a better place? Yep. So again, thanks.